One missing number froze a $9 million project. The first thing I saw that morning was an excavator parked beside my cattle guard. Not on county land, not on a utility easement, on my ranch road. Behind it sat contractor trucks, survey crews, deputies, and an HOA president holding a folder full of approvals she claimed gave her the right to cross my property. Everyone looked confident. Everyone believed the project was already decided. Then I found one missing number buried deep in the paperwork, and suddenly a $9 million pipeline wasn't nearly as legal as everyone thought. What happened next pulled in lawyers, county records, angry homeowners, and a question nobody could answer. If you've ever seen someone act like they owned something that wasn't theirs, you're going to want to stick around for this one. And before we get started, if you enjoy stories about HOA overreach, land rights, ranch life, and ordinary people standing their ground with facts instead of force, take a second to subscribe. We've got plenty more stories like this coming your way. The first thing I saw that morning was an excavator parked beside my cattle guard. Not on the county road, not on a utility easement, not on public land. On my ranch road, the road my family had used for 3 generations. I eased my truck to a stop and stared through the windshield for a few seconds, trying to figure out whether I was looking at a mistake or a lawsuit. The answer arrived fast. Behind the excavator sat 3 contractor pickups, a fuel trailer, 2 survey trucks, and nearly a dozen workers in reflective vests. Several were standing around the hood of a truck studying maps. Others were unloading orange stakes and equipment cases. They looked organized, prepared, confident, like they'd been told they belonged there. The sun had barely cleared the hills west of my property, but the operation was already moving. I stepped out of the truck. The morning air carried the smell of diesel fuel and fresh-cut grass. Somewhere behind me, cattle shifted along the fence line, watching the strangers with the same suspicion I felt. One of the workers glanced up. "Morning, sir." He nodded politely before returning to his map. Not one person asked permission. Not one person looked uncertain. That was when I spotted the black SUV, and standing beside it was Denise Whitmore. Even from 50 yards away, she looked exactly the way she always did. Perfectly pressed blouse, perfect hair, perfect smile. The kind of smile that existed only because she expected people to agree with her. Denise had been president of Canyon Creek Estates for nearly 4 years. Long enough to start believing every problem in the county belonged under her authority. She saw me approaching and immediately smiled wider. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer." I stopped at the gate. "What exactly is happening on my ranch road?" Denise lifted a leather portfolio. "We're beginning preliminary access work." I looked past her toward the equipment. "Access to what?" "The pipeline corridor." She said it casually, like she was talking about landscaping, like nobody had ever questioned it. One of the contractors started an engine behind her. The excavator rumbled to life. My eyes stayed on Denise. "The pipeline company finalized the route," she continued. "Everything has been approved." Approved. Interesting word. A deputy sheriff stood near one of the trucks with his hands resting on his duty belt. He wasn't interfering, but he wasn't smiling either. That got my attention. Somebody had expected resistance. Denise opened her portfolio and produced a stack of documents. "The project value exceeds $9 million, she said. "This route benefits the entire community." Community. Another interesting word. People usually use it right before asking for something that belongs to someone else. She handed me the paperwork. The top page looked impressive. Company logos, survey maps, notary stamps, engineering references, multiple signatures. The sort of packet designed to make people stop asking questions. Several workers watched me. The foreman watched me. Even the deputy watched me. Everyone seemed to expect the same thing. The stubborn rancher would finally realize he'd lost. I started reading. Page 1. Route Overview. Page 2. Construction Schedule. Page 3. Property Descriptions, Legal References, Survey Designations. Everything appeared normal, at first. I flipped another page, then another. The excavator idled beside the gate. Workers waited. Denise folded her arms. She looked relaxed, victorious, like she'd already crossed the finish line. Then I found it. A single line buried near the bottom of a legal description. Most people would have missed it. Most people weren't surveyors. I was. The designation referenced the route crossing, the utility corridor, the connecting parcels, the county easement, the service approach. Everything flowed correctly, until one survey number disappeared. My survey number. The one that legally connected the corridor to the road they were standing on. I read it again. Then again. Nothing. The reference simply wasn't there. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. Not fear. Recognition. The kind that comes when a puzzle piece suddenly refuses to fit. Denise noticed me lingering on the page. "Everything in order?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked up at the excavator, then at the workers, then at the deputy. Nobody knew, not yet. The entire operation was balanced on a detail none of them had spotted. The foreman checked his watch. We should probably get moving. Several workers started gathering equipment. A man picked up a bundle of survey stakes. Another headed toward the cattle guard. Denise smiled. "This doesn't have to be difficult, Mr. Mercer." I finally looked at her. "Who told you this road was part of the corridor?" Her smile flickered, only for a moment. "The approvals were completed months ago." That wasn't an answer. The deputy shifted his weight slightly. The foreman looked impatient. The workers kept preparing. I folded the packet closed. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Denise watched me. "Calling somebody?" "Yes." "Who?" I never took my eyes off the paperwork. "My lawyer." The foreman laughed softly. One of the surveyors exchanged a grin with another worker. Denise looked almost amused, like she'd heard that threat before. Maybe she had, but she hadn't heard it from someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. The phone rang once, twice. Then Rebecca Sloan answered. "Ethan?" I kept my eyes on the missing survey reference. "Rebecca, what happened?" I watched a worker move toward the gate carrying survey stakes. "They brought equipment." A pause. "How much equipment?" "Enough to start construction." The pause became longer. Then I gave her the only detail that mattered. "They forgot a survey number." Silence. Complete silence. The kind lawyers make when they're suddenly doing math in their heads. Finally, she spoke. "You found it?" "Yep." Another pause. Then her voice became very calm, dangerously calm. "Don't let anyone cross that gate." I looked at the worker approaching the cattle guard. "That's the plan. We're coming." The line went dead. I lowered the phone. Denise was still smiling, still confident, still convinced she was holding all the cards. She had no idea Rebecca Sloan was already on her way. And she definitely had no idea that one missing survey reference might stop a $9 million project before the first shovel touched dirt. The worker carrying the stakes reached the gate. I stepped forward. "Nobody crosses." The worker stopped. The foreman frowned. Denise's smile finally disappeared, and for the first time that morning, the people who thought they owned the road started looking at me differently. as if they were beginning to wonder what I had just seen. The same question was already running through my head. If the paperwork was missing something this important, who approved the project in the first place? The question hung in my mind as the worker stopped a few feet from the cattle guard, survey stakes still balanced on his shoulder. Nobody crossed. Not yet. The foreman looked toward Denise. Denise looked toward me. And suddenly, the certainty that had filled the ranch road 15 minutes earlier wasn't quite as solid. "What exactly is the problem?" Denise asked. Her voice remained calm, but there was a sharp edge underneath it now. I held up the packet. "This route description is incomplete." The foreman rolled his eyes. One of the surveyors muttered something under his breath. Denise folded her arms. "That's impossible." "Is it?" She stepped forward and reached for the paperwork. I handed it over. She flipped through the pages quickly, too quickly. The kind of reading people do when they expect to find confirmation instead of answers. "I don't see anything wrong." "I know." Her eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means you're looking at signatures." I pointed to the legal description. "I'm looking at ownership." The deputy shifted slightly beside the gate. The workers had stopped pretending not to listen. The foreman stepped closer. "Sir, we've been cleared through every stage of approval." I looked at him. "By who?" "The project office." "Who approved the road access?" He hesitated. Just for a second. Then he glanced toward Denise. That told me everything. The approval trail led back to her. Denise immediately stepped in. Canyon Creek Estates coordinated the necessary permissions. "Did it?" "Yes." "You own this road?" The question landed harder than I expected. Not because it was complicated, because nobody seemed prepared to answer it. The foreman looked at Denise again. The deputy looked down at the paperwork. Even some of the workers exchanged uncertain glances. Denise recovered quickly. "The corridor was approved through community planning agreements." Interesting. Not ownership, not easement, not deed. Community planning agreements. Lawyers love specific words. People hiding weak positions usually avoid them. I took a step toward the cattle guard. "My family has owned this road since 1958. The foreman frowned. "That's not what we were told." "I believe that." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it changed the atmosphere completely. Before, everyone had assumed I was the obstacle. Now they were beginning to wonder whether somebody else had created one. A pickup appeared at the far end of the road. Dust curled behind it. The vehicle wasn't moving fast. It didn't need to. I recognized it immediately. Rebecca Sloan. Denise followed my gaze. The moment she saw Rebecca's truck, her confidence dipped for the first time all morning. Not much, just enough. "You actually called an attorney?" she asked. I almost laughed. "You brought an excavator?" Rebecca parked beside my fence and climbed out carrying a leather briefcase. She wasn't dramatic, never had been. The reason people feared Rebecca Sloan wasn't because she raised her voice. It was because she rarely needed to. She walked directly toward us. No greeting, no small talk, just business. "Who has the project packet?" Denise handed it over. Rebecca began reading immediately. Page after page. The workers waited. The foreman waited. The deputy waited. Nobody moved. After about 2 minutes, Rebecca stopped. Then she flipped back 3 pages, then 1 page forward, then back again. I watched her expression change. Not surprise. Confirmation. She had found it. Denise noticed. "What?" Rebecca looked up. "Who prepared these route descriptions?" "The project engineering team." "Which engineer?" "I don't know." Rebecca tapped the page. "You should." The foreman stepped forward. "Ma'am, if there's a concern, We'd appreciate clarification. Rebecca handed him the packet. Survey reference 18-B is missing. The foreman stared at her. So? Rebecca pointed toward the road beneath our feet. Because 18-B is the only survey that legally connects this route to this access point. The foreman's face went blank. The deputy frowned. Several workers exchanged confused looks. Denise spoke immediately. That's just a clerical issue. Rebecca turned toward her. No. The word landed like a hammer. No, Ms. Whitmore. A clerical issue is a typo. She pointed at the road. This determines whether anyone standing here has legal authority to enter private property. Nobody said anything. The diesel engine idling behind the excavator suddenly sounded very loud. Rebecca continued. Without that survey reference, the route doesn't legally reach this road. The foreman looked down at the paperwork again. I mean, your access documentation has a hole in it. The workers stopped talking altogether. The deputy finally stepped forward. Are you saying they can't proceed? Rebecca looked at him calmly. I'm saying that if they proceed before verifying ownership, they're assuming significant legal risk. That got everyone's attention. Because risk means money, and money gets heard faster than law. Denise's face tightened. This project has been reviewed for months. Rebecca nodded. I'm sure it has. Then you're wrong. Rebecca smiled slightly. The kind of smile that usually meant somebody was about to have a party day. Then the county records will prove it. For the first time, Denise didn't answer immediately. I noticed it. The deputy noticed it. Even the foreman noticed it. Because certainty had become hesitation, and hesitation spreads. The foreman slowly lowered his radio. What do we do? Rebecca closed her briefcase. You verify ownership. How long will that take? Depends how quickly somebody explains why a critical survey reference disappeared. Nobody had an answer. Not Denise. Not the contractors. Not the deputy. Nobody. The excavator remained parked. The survey stakes remained unloaded. The gate remained closed. And standing there on my ranch road, watching the project grind to a halt over a single missing line of text, I began to realize something much bigger might be happening. Because projects worth $9 million don't usually forget details like this. Someone had approved the route. Someone had approved the access. Someone had convinced contractors, engineers, and deputies that everything was legitimate. The question wasn't whether a mistake existed anymore. The question was who benefited from it, and why. I didn't get the answer standing at the gate. Not that morning. The contractors eventually backed away from the cattle guard. The deputy remained nearby. Rebecca stayed long enough to exchange contact information with the foreman before heading back toward her truck. Denise left last. Before climbing into her SUV, she stopped beside me. This isn't over, Ethan. I looked at the excavator still parked outside my fence. I know. You can't stop progress forever. There it was again. Progress. People always called it progress when they wanted something that belonged to somebody else. Denise drove away in a cloud of dust. The ranch road became quiet again. But the silence didn't feel like victory. It felt like a countdown. Because somebody had invested millions of dollars into a route that crossed my property. Projects that large don't simply disappear. They come back, usually harder. That afternoon, I drove deeper into the ranch, past the stock pond, past the cedar breaks, past the old cattle crossing that connected the north pasture to the lower creek. Eventually, I reached the place that mattered. The meadow. Most people would have driven right past it. To outsiders, it was just another patch of Texas land bordered by live oaks and fed by a narrow creek winding through limestone. To me, it was the center of everything. I parked beside an old wooden fence and walked the rest of the way. The wildflowers were beginning to bloom. Bluebonnets, Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans. Thousands of them spread across the field. Lily had planted most of them herself. Years earlier, before cancer started taking pieces of her life one appointment at a time, she'd spent entire weekends out here carrying seed bags and a shovel. While other people vacationed at beaches or resorts, Lily worked on this meadow. She called it her restoration project. I called it stubbornness. The truth was probably somewhere in between. I sat on the weathered bench overlooking the creek. The same bench we'd shared countless evenings. The same bench where she made me promise something near the end. Protect it. Not the ranch. Not the house, this place, the meadow. Back then I thought she was talking about flowers. Later I realized she was talking about memory. The pipeline maps spread across the passenger seat of my truck had changed that understanding. Because the route didn't simply touch the ranch. It crossed directly through the meadow. The line cut through the creek crossing, crossed the cattle trail, then passed straight through the section Lily had spent years rebuilding. I pulled the folded project map from my jacket pocket. The black corridor line looked harmless on paper. Just ink. Just engineering. Just planning. But every inch of that line translated into equipment, trenching, access roads, and construction traffic. I studied it again. The route wasn't random. That was what bothered me. There were easier alternatives, county roads, utility corridors, open grazing land farther south. Yet somehow the chosen route threaded directly through the most sensitive section of my property. Rebecca had noticed the same thing. Before leaving the gate that morning, she'd asked a question that hadn't left my head. Who selected the alignment? Not who approved it. Who selected it? Because those were two different things. One involved paperwork, the other involved intent. My phone buzzed. Rebecca. I answered immediately. What did you find? Nothing yet, she said. But I made a few calls. And? The pipeline company insists the route came from regional planning recommendations. I frowned. Regional planning by who? That's what I'm trying to figure out. The answer didn't sit right. Neither did the silence that followed. Finally, Rebecca spoke again. Ethan, there's something else. I stood. What? The route wasn't the first thing they requested. A cold feeling settled into my chest. What was? Access. I looked toward the creek, toward Lily's meadow, toward the exact stretch of land highlighted on the project map. Rebecca continued. Months before the pipeline proposal appeared, somebody started requesting information about that crossing. Who? I don't know yet. That answer bothered me more than any legal issue, because somebody had been interested in my land long before the project officially existed, long before Denise showed up with an excavator, long before anyone talked about community benefits. Somebody had been looking at this property, studying it, planning around it. The question was no longer whether the route had been chosen intentionally. The question was how far back the plan really went, and whether Denise Whitmore had been part of it from the beginning. I got my first answer 5 days later. Not from a lawyer, not from county records, from a survey flag. It was bright orange and planted beside the creek crossing near Lily's meadow. I spotted it while checking fence lines after a storm. Then I found another, and another. By the time I reached the far side of the pasture, there were more than a dozen markers stretching across my property in a straight line, the same line shown on the pipeline map. I pulled one from the ground and tossed it into the bed of my truck. Before I could grab the second, a white pickup rolled across the ranch road. 2 men stepped out carrying surveying equipment. Neither looked surprised to see me. "Morning," one of them said. I pointed at the flags. "Who told you to put those there?" The older surveyor checked his tablet. We were informed access had already been coordinated. There was that word again. Coordinated. Nobody ever said approved. Nobody ever said authorized. Just coordinated. By who? I asked. The younger surveyor looked uncomfortable. The older man hesitated. Then he answered, Canyon Creek Estates. I almost laughed. The HOA? That's our understanding. I pointed toward the pasture. The HOA doesn't own this land. Both men went quiet. The older surveyor looked down at his tablet again. The younger one shifted his weight. For the first time, they looked less certain than when they arrived. To their credit, they packed up immediately. No argument, no threats, no confrontation, just confusion. That bothered me more, because confusion meant somebody else had given them bad information. And apparently, they believed it, the same way everyone else did. A week later, I learned how deep that belief went. Rebecca called while I was repairing a water trough. I want you to attend a board meeting. Canyon Creek? Tonight. I already knew who would be there. Denise, I drove over anyway. The clubhouse was full. Residents packed the folding chairs. Some held project brochures. Others carried handouts. Everyone seemed optimistic. Denise stood at the front of the room beside a projector screen displaying maps and charts. She looked completely in control. The pipeline project represents a major opportunity, she announced. Several people nodded. One man even applauded. Denise clicked to the next slide. Projected savings, infrastructure improvements, property value increases, community growth. Every promise sounded better than the last. Then residents started asking questions. Will dues go down? That's the expectation. Will emergency services improve? That's part of the long-term plan. What about property values? We anticipate significant benefits. Every answer sounded polished, confident, carefully practiced. Then an elderly woman near the back raised her hand. I recognized her immediately. Martha Jenkins. She had lived in Canyon Creek longer than most of the board members. What about the landowners? She asked. The room quieted. Denise smiled. Discussions are progressing positively. Martha frowned. Does that mean they agreed? For the first time all evening, Denise paused. Only for a second. But I noticed it. So did Rebecca. Because positive discussions and permission were not the same thing. The meeting moved on. But Martha wasn't finished. Afterward, she approached me in the parking lot carrying a thick folder. I've been meaning to ask somebody about this. She handed it to me. Inside were community support forms distributed by the HOA months earlier. At first glance, they looked harmless. Road planning, future infrastructure, regional cooperation, normal language. Until I reached the final pages, buried inside was wording supporting future utility corridor negotiations. Not approval, not ownership, just enough legal language to create the appearance of support. Martha shook her head. They told us it was about road maintenance. I looked down at the paperwork. Did a lot of people sign these? Most of the neighborhood. A cold feeling settled into my chest. Residents thought they were helping their community. Contractors thought access had been coordinated. Surveyors thought permission existed. Everyone believed somebody else had verified the facts. Nobody actually had. As I drove home that night, one realization became impossible to ignore. The pipeline wasn't moving forward because people had seen proof. It was moving forward because people kept repeating the same story. And the more often they repeated it, the more real it became. But stories and ownership weren't the same thing. Sooner or later, somebody would have to prove the difference. The only question was whether Denise Whitmore knew the story was false, or whether she'd started believing it herself. Rebecca wasn't interested in guessing. She wanted records. 3 days after the board meeting, we were sitting in the county records office surrounded by survey maps, deed books, title files, and enough paperwork to fill the bed of a pickup. Most people imagine property disputes being settled in courtrooms. They usually start in archives. Rebecca spread several maps across a wooden table. "Start here," she said. The first map showed my ranch boundary exactly as it had existed for decades. The creek crossing, the cattle trail, the ranch road. Everything matched. Nothing surprising. The second map showed the proposed pipeline route. That was where things got interesting. The corridor crossed my property, crossed the creek, crossed Lily's meadow, then connected to a road the project documents claimed was available for access. Rebecca tapped the connection point. "That's where the missing survey reference belongs." I nodded. "And without it? The route doesn't legally connect." Simple answer. Big problem. We spent the next several hours tracing ownership history backward. Every transfer, every subdivision, every easement, every recorded restriction. The farther we went, the cleaner the chain became. The ranch road had never been transferred, never dedicated, never conveyed, never donated. Not once. Not ever. It remained private property from the day my grandfather recorded it. Rebecca leaned back. "So how does an HOA grant access to something it never owned?" That was the question. And the deeper we dug, the stranger the answer became. The next file came from county planning records, then utility filings, then project correspondence. Each document referenced another. Each approval cited previous approvals. The paperwork looked impressive, until we started checking the source material. That's when the holes appeared. One approval referenced a supporting attachment that didn't exist. Another cited a planning recommendation without identifying the underlying authority. A third relied on community support forms like the ones Martha Jenkins had shown me. Everything pointed somewhere, but eventually every trail ended the same way. Nothing. Rebecca circled a paragraph. "Look at this." I read it carefully. Regional Access Corridor, Future Utility Accommodation, Cooperative Infrastructure Pathway. Legal-sounding phrases. None of them created ownership. None of them granted easements. None of them authorized entry. It was language designed to sound stronger than it actually was. The project wasn't standing on a legal foundation. It was standing on assumptions. Late that afternoon, Rebecca arranged a meeting with a retired title examiner named Harold Price. 40 years reviewing land records had given Harold a reputation for two things: accuracy and bluntness. He spent nearly an hour reviewing the file. Then he removed his glasses. "I've seen this before." Rebecca looked up. "Meaning?" "People stopped checking." He pointed at the project documents. "One person assumes authority exists. Another person repeats it. Then another. Eventually, nobody verifies anything because everyone thinks somebody else already did." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, because that matched exactly what we'd been seeing. Surveyors assumed, contractors assumed, residents assumed, the pipeline company assumed, even county staff appeared to assume. Harold opened another file. The HOA never owned the road. We know. They never owned the crossing. We know. He looked directly at me. Then nobody can legally grant access across either one. Hearing it stated that clearly felt different. Not hope. Certainty. For weeks, Denise had acted as though ownership was a technicality. The record said otherwise. Before leaving, Harold slid one final document across the table. A certified ownership history. Every transfer, every survey reference, every legal description, no gaps, no confusion, no corridor, no HOA authority, nothing. Rebecca smiled for the first time all day. Now we can prove it. Outside, the sun was beginning to drop behind the courthouse. We carried the files back to the truck. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me since the excavator appeared at my gate. If it's this obvious, why hasn't anyone stopped the project? Rebecca closed the tailgate. Because nobody wanted to be the first person to question it. She handed me the certified records. That changes now. For the first time since this started, the balance of power felt different. Not because we'd won, because we'd found something stronger than an argument. Evidence. And evidence was about to force everyone involved to make a choice. Either stop or move forward, knowing they'd been warned. Rebecca chose to make that decision impossible to misunderstand. 3 days after we left the county records office, her conference table disappeared beneath stacks of certified documents. Ownership histories, survey records, deed chains, county maps, everything we'd spent weeks verifying. Every page told the same story. The HOA never owned the road. The HOA never controlled the crossing. The HOA never possessed authority to grant access. Now it was time to make sure everyone else knew it. Rebecca prepared notices for every party connected to the project. The pipeline company, their legal department, project managers, engineering consultants, county planning officials, contractors, and of course, Canyon Creek Estates. Every packet contained the same evidence. Every packet contained the same warning. Proceed at your own risk. I watched her seal the final envelope. What happens if they listen? Rebecca shrugged. The project stops. And if they don't? Her expression hardened. Then they own the consequences. The notices went out that afternoon. Certified mail. Signature required. No confusion. No excuses. No way for anyone to claim they hadn't received them. For a few days, nothing happened. Then the responses started arriving. The first came from an engineering consultant. Polite. Careful. They thanked Rebecca for the information and stated they were reviewing the ownership concerns. The second came from a project coordinator. Same tone, same caution. The third response changed things. It came from the pipeline company's legal department. Rebecca called me as soon as she received it. I've got something. I drove into town immediately. By the time I arrived, the letter was waiting on her desk. I read it twice. The company acknowledged receiving our records, acknowledged the ownership dispute, acknowledged the missing survey reference. Then came the part that mattered. The project team believed all necessary permissions had been secured through community representatives. Community representatives. I stared at the phrase. There it was again. Nobody claimed ownership. Nobody cited a deed. Nobody referenced an easement. Everything kept tracing back to the same vague authority. Community representatives. That's Denise Asaita, I said. Rebecca nodded. Or somebody speaking on behalf of the HOA. I looked out her office window. So they're still moving forward. For now. That answer bothered me. Not because they disagreed with us, because they seemed comfortable doing it. The evidence wasn't complicated. The ownership records weren't ambiguous. Yet nobody wanted to be the person who slammed the brakes. Momentum had become its own form of authority. And momentum is dangerous, especially when millions of dollars are involved. A week later, Earl Thompson called. Earl owned a feed store outside town and somehow knew everything happening in the county before anyone else. You need to hear this. His voice sounded uneasy. What happened? There was another HOA meeting. I already knew where this was going. And? Residents started asking questions. That got my attention. Questions meant doubt. Doubt meant cracks. Earl continued. People heard rumors about disputed property rights. What did Denise say? A short pause. She said all approvals remain valid, and the project is fully authorized. I closed my eyes. Of course she did. Even after receiving certified records, even after receiving legal notice, even after being shown evidence. She doubled down. Rebecca wasn't surprised when I told her. People commit to stories, she said. The bigger the story becomes, the harder it is to admit it's wrong. The following week proved her point. Project updates continued appearing online. Contractors remained scheduled. Equipment reservations remained active. Survey work continued around neighboring properties. Nothing slowed down. If anything, the project seemed to accelerate. That was when Rebecca stopped trying to convince people. Instead, she started documenting them. Every response, every email, every notice, every acknowledgement, every signature. She built a timeline, a detailed record showing exactly who knew what and when they knew it. One afternoon, she spread the file across my kitchen table. Months of paperwork, dozens of names, hundreds of pages, a roadmap of warnings. We're finished chasing them. I looked up. What does that mean? It means everyone has been informed. She tapped the stack. The next move belongs to them. I understood immediately. The argument was over. The facts were already delivered. The ownership records existed. The notices existed. The warnings existed. Nobody could claim ignorance anymore. Outside, the late afternoon sun reflected off the stock pond beyond the barn. The ranch felt peaceful, but underneath that calm, something had shifted. The project still existed. The equipment still existed. The plans still existed. But now every person involved stood at the same crossroads: stop or proceed despite the evidence. 3 days later, Rebecca received a scheduling notice from the project office. Construction mobilization had been approved. Equipment deployment was confirmed. Work crews had been assigned. Access preparation would begin the following week. I read the notice in silence, then handed it back. Rebecca didn't look surprised. Neither did I. Because deep down we'd both suspected the same thing. They were going to keep moving. Not because they were right. Because they'd already invested too much to turn around. Rebecca closed the file. For the first time in weeks, she smiled. Not because the situation was improving, because it wasn't. But because something important had finally happened. They made their choice. I looked at the construction schedule, at the deployment dates, at the list of equipment headed toward my ranch. Then I looked back at her. What happens now? Rebecca slid the file into her briefcase. Now we let them arrive. 8 days later, they did. I heard them before I saw them. Diesel engines, heavy trailers, the low metallic rattle of equipment moving over cattle guards. By the time I reached the ranch entrance, the convoy was already assembling outside the gate. 3 contractor trucks, 2 equipment haulers, a fuel trailer, survey vehicles, the same excavator from before. Only this time, nobody seemed interested in asking questions. They came expecting access. They came expecting progress. Most importantly, they came expecting me to step aside. Denise Whitmore arrived last. Her black SUV rolled to the front of the line and parked beside the contractors. She stepped out, smiling. Not cautiously, not defensively, confidently, like the last few weeks had never happened, like the certified notices had never existed, like Rebecca Sloan had never challenged a single document. The foreman checked his watch. Workers began unloading equipment. Survey stakes appeared. Tripods came off trucks. The operation looked ready to move. I stayed near the cattle guard, waiting. Denise spotted me immediately. "Morning, Ethan." I nodded. She looked past me toward the ranch. "We should be finished with preliminary access work by the end of the day." Interesting. Not if. When? The project had already become reality inside her head. One of the deputies standing nearby glanced toward me, then toward the equipment, then toward Denise. Nobody seemed entirely comfortable anymore. Not after the notices, not after the questions. But nobody had stopped the project either. Not yet. The foreman approached carrying a clipboard. "We're proceeding according to schedule." I looked at the equipment. "I can see that." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The legal department is reviewing some of the documentation. But we're still authorized to mobilize." Authorized. Another word doing a lot of heavy lifting. Before I could answer, another truck appeared at the far end of the road. Then another. The first belonged to Rebecca. The second wasn't familiar. That changed when the driver stepped out. Suit, briefcase, company badge, pipeline legal. The name on the badge read Ben Crawford. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Workers noticed, deputies noticed, even Denise noticed. Because company lawyers don't usually visit routine construction sites. Ben walked directly toward the gathering. Rebecca joined him. Neither looked happy. The foreman straightened. Denise moved forward with renewed confidence. "Perfect timing," she said. "We can finally clear this up." Rebecca said nothing. She opened the back of her truck, then removed 2 thick binders, certified records, ownership histories, survey references, months of evidence, the same documents we'd assembled piece by piece. Ben accepted the binders and began reading. At first, nobody paid much attention. Workers continued unloading equipment. The excavator remained running. Survey crews prepared stakes. Then Ben stopped on one page, turned back, read it again. The foreman noticed. So did Denise. "What is it?" she asked. Ben didn't answer. Instead, he flipped several more pages. County records, ownership chains, historical surveys. The silence grew heavier with every page. Workers gradually stopped what they were doing. One by one. The sound of equipment faded. The excavator idled alone. Finally, Ben looked up. His eyes settled on Denise. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did Canyon Creek Estates ever own this road?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The question landed harder than any argument Rebecca or I had made, because it came from the pipeline company itself. Denise blinked. "The corridor falls under community authority." Ben didn't react. "That's not what I asked." The foreman slowly lowered his clipboard. One worker shut off a generator. Another stopped carrying survey stakes. Everything seemed to freeze. Ben repeated the question. "Did the HOA ever own this road?" Denise opened her folder, flipped through papers, looked for something. Anything. The confidence she'd worn all morning began slipping. Not dramatically, just enough for everyone to notice. Rebecca stepped forward. She opened one of the binders and laid several certified maps across the hood of a truck. Ownership records, historical plats, survey references, every document connected perfectly. No missing links, no assumptions. Facts. Ben studied them carefully. Then he compared them against the project packet. The difference was obvious. One version relied on authority. The other relied on ownership. And ownership wins every time. The foreman finally spoke. "Is there a problem?" Ben closed the binder. A simple motion. But it changed everything. "Yes." Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The workers stared. The deputies watched. Denise looked like she was waiting for reality to correct itself. Instead, Ben looked toward the equipment lined up outside my gate, then toward the ranch road, then toward the crew, and said the words nobody expected to hear. Nobody moves forward. Silence. Absolute silence. The excavator continued idling, but nobody touched it. Nobody crossed the cattle guard. Nobody entered the ranch. For the first time since this began, the project wasn't moving toward my property. It was stopping. And judging by the look on Denise Whitmore's face, she had just realized she might not be able to start it again. For several seconds, nobody moved. The workers stood beside equipment they no longer seemed eager to unload. The foreman stared at Ben Crawford. Ben stared at the documents, and Denise stared at reality coming apart in front of her. "This is absurd," she finally said. Nobody responded. Not because they agreed, because they were waiting. Ben opened the binder again and pointed to the ownership records spread across the hood of the truck. "These certified copies came from the county archives?" Rebecca nodded. "Every page." Ben turned another page. "And the ownership chain is complete?" "Yes." Another page. "The road was never transferred?" "Never." The foreman rubbed his forehead. One of the surveyors quietly lowered the bundle of stakes he'd been carrying. Another worker shut down a second engine. The sounds of construction disappeared one machine at a time. Denise stepped closer. "The project approvals are already in place." Ben looked up. Approvals from whom?" "The HOA." "To grant what authority?" Silence. The question hung there. Simple, direct, dangerous. Denise opened her folder again. She flipped through maps, meeting summaries, project schedules, emails, everything except the one thing Ben was asking for: ownership. Rebecca watched without saying a word. She didn't need to. The records were doing the talking now. The deputy nearest the gate stepped forward, not aggressively, just enough to make it clear that nobody would be crossing anything until the situation was resolved. The message landed immediately. The foreman looked at Ben. "What are your instructions?" Ben closed the binder. "All activity is suspended pending legal review." The foreman blinked. "Immediately?" "Immediately." A worker near the excavator muttered something under his breath. Another looked toward the fuel trailer. Nobody argued, because nobody wanted their name attached to a project that had suddenly become a legal question. And legal questions cost money. A lot of money. Denise's composure began cracking. Not dramatically, just enough. "This is a temporary delay." Nobody answered. "The records need clarification." Still, nobody answered. "The corridor remains valid." Even she sounded less certain now. The foreman looked down at the paperwork in his hands, then toward my ranch road, then back toward Ben. The confidence he'd arrived with was gone, because confidence depends on assumptions, and assumptions had just collided with evidence. One worker started securing equipment back onto a trailer. Another collected the survey stakes. The convoy that had arrived expecting a construction launch was now preparing to leave. That was when Denise finally turned toward me. Her eyes were hard, angry, embarrassed. "You planned this." I almost laughed. "Planned what?" "This delay." Rebecca answered before I could. "The county planned it." Denise looked confused. Rebecca tapped the certified records. "The deeds planned it." Nobody said anything after that, because there wasn't much left to say. Facts have a way of ending arguments, especially when they're written into public records. Ben gathered the binders. The deputies relaxed slightly. The workers continued packing equipment. Every minute that passed made the situation more real. The project wasn't moving forward today. The gate wasn't opening, and the road wasn't changing hands. Not now, maybe not ever. As the last survey equipment disappeared into a truck bed, Ben approached Rebecca. I couldn't hear most of the conversation, but I caught one sentence. "We need to know how this happened." That caught my attention, because until that moment, everyone had been focused on whether the project could continue. Now the question was different. How had it reached this point in the first place? Who told the pipeline company the HOA had authority? Who approved access requests? Who verified ownership? Or worse, who never bothered to verify it at all? The convoy began leaving one vehicle at a time. The excavator was the last to go. Its tracks rattled across the road before disappearing beyond the trees. For the first time all morning, the ranch entrance looked normal again. The cattle guard sat empty. The gate remained closed. The road remained mine. Denise stayed beside her SUV longer than everyone else, watching, thinking, trying to understand how months of planning had collapsed in less than an hour. Eventually, she got into her vehicle and drove away without another word. Rebecca stood beside me until the dust settled. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I looked toward the meadow beyond the hills. Lily's meadow, still untouched, still safe, for now. Rebecca followed my gaze. "We stopped the project." I nodded. "But?" She closed one of the binders. "This isn't about the project anymore." I turned toward her. And what is it about? The investigation that's coming. Because somewhere between the missing survey reference, the false assumptions, the ownership records, and the certified warnings everyone ignored, something much larger had begun to emerge, and somebody was going to have to explain it. The first sign came from the pipeline company itself. 4 days after construction stopped at my gate, Ben Crawford called Rebecca. The company had opened an internal review. At first, that didn't sound unusual. Projects get reviewed all the time. Then Ben explained what they were reviewing. Not the route, not the engineering, the approvals. Specifically, who had represented that access rights already existed. That changed everything. Within 2 weeks, requests for documentation started moving through Canyon Creek Estates. Residents wanted answers. Board members wanted answers. The pipeline company wanted answers. County officials wanted answers. Suddenly, everyone was asking the same question. Who verified ownership? Nobody seemed able to produce a clear answer. The project files were full of assumptions, references, recommendations, community support forms, meeting summaries. But when investigators asked for the document granting legal authority over my ranch road, the conversation always stopped, because the document didn't exist. Rebecca received copies of several information requests. Then another surprise arrived. Martha Jenkins called. "Ethan, I think people are finally paying attention." That alone told me things had changed. Martha had attended HOA meetings for years. Most residents rarely questioned anything. Now they were demanding records. "What happened?" I asked. "They held a special meeting." "And?" Martha laughed softly. "It didn't go well." According to Martha, residents filled the clubhouse, not because they wanted updates, because they wanted explanations. One homeowner stood up and asked a simple question. Did the board actually have authority to approve this project? Nobody answered immediately. Another resident asked where project-related planning funds had been spent. Another asked why affected landowners hadn't been consulted directly. Then someone asked about the support forms. The room reportedly became very quiet, because people were finally comparing what they had been told, and the stories didn't match. Some residents had been promised lower dues. Others had been promised higher property values. Others believed the project would generate future infrastructure revenue. Different audiences, different promises. Same project. The more people talked, the more contradictions surfaced. By the end of the meeting, nobody seemed interested in Denise's presentations anymore. They wanted records. A week later, the county requested additional project documentation. Then auditors became involved. Not criminal investigators, not police, auditors. The kind of people who quietly follow paper trails until somebody gets uncomfortable. Rebecca loved auditors. They don't care who sounds convincing, she said. They care what's documented. And documentation was becoming a problem. The deeper reviewers looked, the more gaps they found. Meeting minutes referencing attachments that couldn't be located. Project summaries describing approvals that never formally existed. Communications that suggested authority without ever proving it. Nothing looked dramatic on its own. Together, they painted a different picture. A project that had grown faster than its foundation. One afternoon, Ben Crawford drove out to the ranch, not as an adversary, as someone trying to understand what had happened. We sat on my porch overlooking the lower pasture. He carried a thick folder. The investigation had already generated hundreds of pages. Honestly, he admitted, I think people stopped asking questions. I nodded. That sounded familiar. Ben opened the file. One consultant relied on HOA representations. Then another relied on those representations. Then contractors relied on the consultants. Then project managers relied on everyone else. He shook his head. Eventually, nobody verified anything. The same conclusion Harold Price had reached months earlier. The same conclusion Rebecca had warned about. Assumption had become accepted truth. And accepted truth had nearly put construction equipment through Lily's meadow. Before leaving, Ben shared one final piece of information. The pipeline company had suspended the route indefinitely. Not delayed, suspended. The distinction mattered, because delays can be reversed. Indefinite suspensions usually mean something much deeper is wrong. The pressure inside Canyon Creek Estates intensified. Board members started distancing themselves from earlier decisions. Several publicly stated they had relied on information provided during project discussions. Others claimed they were never shown complete ownership records. The blame was beginning to move, and it was moving toward Denise Whitmore. For the first time since this began, her position looked vulnerable. Not because Ethan Mercer had stopped a pipeline, not because Rebecca Sloan had found a missing survey reference, because dozens of people were now reading the same documents for themselves. And documents don't care about charisma. They don't care about confidence. They don't care about speeches. The truth was sitting in black ink inside county records. Anyone could see it. Which raised one final question. Would Denise simply lose her position? Or would the investigation uncover something even worse? In the end, the answer turned out to be both simpler and more damaging than anyone expected. There was no secret conspiracy, no hidden land deal, no dramatic confession, just something far more common. People had stopped verifying facts. The investigation continued for several months. Auditors reviewed board communications. Attorneys examined project files. County officials compared public records against project representations. Every review reached roughly the same conclusion. The HOA had acted far beyond its actual authority. The pipeline company had relied on assumptions that were never properly verified, and multiple decisions had been made based on representations that should have been checked long before construction equipment ever appeared at my gate. As the findings became public, support for Denise Whitmore evaporated. Not overnight, but steadily. One resident after another began asking questions she could no longer answer. Why were homeowners told different things? Why were support forms described differently to different people? Why was ownership never independently verified? Why did nobody stop when concerns were raised? The questions kept coming. The answers never improved. A special election was eventually scheduled inside Canyon Creek Estates. Attendance was the highest anyone could remember. Residents who had ignored HOA meetings for years suddenly cared very much about governance. Funny how that works. When decisions affect landscaping, people stay home. When decisions almost trigger a multi-million-dollar legal disaster, everyone shows up. By the end of the evening, new board members had been elected. Transparency policies were adopted. Independent legal review became mandatory for major projects. Future infrastructure proposals would require direct verification instead of assumptions. The reforms were practical, necessary, long overdue. As for Denise, she resigned before the final transition was complete. No speeches, no farewell celebration, no dramatic defense. Just a quiet departure from the position she'd once seemed determined to hold forever. The strange part was that I didn't feel triumphant. For months I'd imagined what victory might look like. Turns out it looked a lot like paperwork. Binders, records, meeting minutes, certified copies. The things most people find boring. The things that ultimately changed everything. One afternoon near the end of summer, Martha Jenkins drove out to the ranch. She climbed out of her car carrying a small envelope. "Thought you should have this." Inside was a handwritten card. Dozens of signatures filled the pages. Residents from Canyon Creek Estates, people I'd never met, people who had once believed the project was fully authorized, people who had eventually taken the time to read the records themselves. At the bottom of the card was a simple message. "Thank you for standing your ground." I looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Not because I needed recognition, because it reminded me why the fight mattered. The issue had never been winning. It had been making sure facts mattered more than assumptions. A week later, I walked down to Lily's meadow. The creek flowed through the same limestone channel it always had. Wildflowers covered the hillside. The cattle trail remained untouched. No trench. No construction road. No pipeline corridor. Just the land exactly as it was supposed to be. I sat on the old bench overlooking the water, the same place where Lily once made me promise to protect it. For the first time in months, the ranch felt quiet again. Not the uneasy silence that comes before conflict, the peaceful kind that comes after it. My phone buzzed. It was Rebecca. "Thought you'd want to know," she said. "What now?" "The pipeline company officially abandoned the route." I smiled. Not because we had defeated someone, because the truth had finally caught up with the story. After we hung up, I stayed there a while longer watching sunlight move across the meadow, thinking about everything that had happened. The excavator, the missing survey reference, the HOA meetings, the warnings, the investigation. All of it traced back to one simple problem. People trusted assumptions more than evidence. Eventually I stood and started back toward the ranch house. The gate remained closed, the road remained private, the meadow remained untouched, and the lesson remained the same. People can sound important. Documents can look official. Entire groups can repeat the same claim for months. None of that changes reality. Ownership matters. Facts matter. And whenever somebody tells you they already have permission to use your land, your road, your water, or your property, ask them one question. Show me the paperwork. The meadow survived. The truth won. And the gate never opened.
If there's one lesson I take from this story, it's that assumption can travel a long way, but sooner or later they run into fast. Nobody stopped that pipeline with threats, arguments, or force. It was stopped because someone took the time to check the records, ask the right questions, and follow the truth wherever it led. That's not always exciting, and it doesn't always happen quickly, but it's how real problems get solved. I think there's something worth remembering in that. Whether it's a ranch plot, a family home, or a piece of land that's been part of your life for years, something deserves patience, persistence, and careful attention. Standing your ground doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's as simple as refusing to ignore what you know is right and being willing to let the facts speak for themselves. I'd love to hear from you. How do you ever deal with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where the paperwork tells a different story than the people involved? If so, drop a yes in the comments. And if you believe it's always worth checking the facts before making big decisions, time show me the paperwork. If you enjoyed this story and want more real-world HOA conflict, ranch story, land dispute, and tales of quiet determination, be sure to subscribe. We'll be glad to have you along for the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and thanks for spending your time here with me.